Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, over 5,000 people disappear in Ukraine every year. Now, that staggering statistic is according to the Ukrainian Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights. But in fact, that number could be much higher amid the backdrop of Russia's war in eastern Ukraine and the temporary occupation of Crimea by Russia. Now, today, we're talking about this topic with Maria Gureva, who is the Media and Communications Officer at Amnesty International Ukraine. Maria, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
So, as I said, it's a surprising statistic, and it's not something that people really talk about, because we know a lot about the high-profile political prisoners who are perhaps in Russia or in Crimea, but not so much about the other 4,900 that are disappearing. So firstly, can you tell us a bit about the plight of these disappearing people, the reasons why they disappear, and what Amnesty International is doing to get them back and find them?
With the development of the conflict, we can see that a new tendency is appearing, which is enforced disappearances. And what enforced disappearances mean is that people get arrested or they just disappear with state involvement or with state knowing about the fact and ignoring, not willing to do anything with that. So these people, the number is definitely lower than the one you mentioned, and this is rather state business. Yeah, when people disappeared, rather
to do with the state.
Yes,
okay.
So basically, the state kidnaps people and then denies that they have it, and that's what happened with well, a state or different state, quasi-state actors.
State actors, you know,
yes. So that's what happened in eastern Ukraine in so-called republics, when so-called Ministry of State Security kidnaps people, and then for weeks they deny that they have them. That's what happened to Stanislav Aseyev. It's a journalist that worked in Donetsk. He was writing articles about daily life in so-called republic for a number of Ukrainian media. And then suddenly he disappeared, and when his relatives came to his flat, they saw that it was searched, and they saw that there were significant signs of the involvement of security forces of so-called republic. And for a long time, his mother did a lot to find out what happened. And for quite a long time, so-called government refused to acknowledge that they have it.
Yeah, so it's really traumatic for the family, though, because they don't know where their relatives have gone. And they can't even track them. I guess there's no way, even in occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, there's no authority that you can go to. And what about Amnesty International as well? I mean, are you able to work in occupied regions of eastern Ukraine?
Unfortunately, we, as well as other organizations, are not able to work there permanently and are not able to monitor the situation there. What we can do is we can do researches about what's going on. And last summer we issued a research about enforced disappearances and torture on both sides of armed conflict, which means the so-called republics and the rest of territory of Ukraine.
And that's important to note as well, that it's happening on both sides of the conflict.
It's happening on both sides, and even more of that, it happens with quite the same it's quite typical. It's the same pattern you can.
I see. So it's not a new phenomenon either. It's been happening for a long time.
It's rather old Soviet school of security forces. That's how they act. And they do it on both sides. So on the side of Ukraine control side, we found several cases, actually 18, about people being kidnapped by state security service. They've been held incommunicado for weeks and for months, tortured. They were held without any access to advocates, doctors, relatives, anything. Some of them were released later on, and the kidnappers said that we give you 200 hryvnias, and then you go and you don't tell anyone where have you been for this time. Otherwise, you will just come and kill you.
Well, that's a serious problem.
That's quite a serious problem.
Of course, and especially if it's official government bodies or the security services.
We called it secret prisons because basically they were secret prisons. People weren't. There was no court, nothing, no investigation about whether these people were actually guilty or not. They were just held there for a long period.
I see.
And security service never admitted they have this. Although they released these people we mentioned in our list.
Yeah, and I would imagine NGOs like not just Amnesty International, but other human rights groups who are working on both sides of the front line must have a really difficult task to obtain this information, where missing people are, where they were last seen, that sort of thing. So what strategy does Amnesty International have to get this information?
We have quite typical methodologies of our research, which include, first of all, communication with people, with victims, with their relatives, advocates. We also analyze media. We also try to get any kind of documentation, like medical reports, which can very often document the signs of torture. And then we analyze, check this information, and we say that this is what we found. Of course, we are not a prosecutor office. Yeah? We cannot say that this person is guilty in this and this.
Yeah.
But what we give, we can provide
You can provide some information, some evidence, because
I just forgot the word in English.
No, it's okay, it's no problem. But actually, I also wanted to ask you. I read a very interesting article recently online to say, which basically summarised and said how important digital media is, how important these open sources are now to finding people. Could you talk a bit more about that and what sort of sources? And how these open sources are used to track people down? What sort of ways do they use to track these people?
I think the best organization that deals with this kind of data is Bellingcat.
And which is pretty famous, you know.
Pretty famous, yeah. And they provide quite detailed description of how people can be tracked via social media. On our side, we try to use all information we receive. But for us, it's also very important that actually this documentation kind of thing, because it's the basis for future investigation. So we definitely use open data, we definitely use all possible means to find. And we also cooperate with other organizations. Like during our previous research, we cooperated with United Nations, and it appeared that they have pretty similar information to ours. So we even had this common list with names, and we checked these people who were actually held incommunicado, and later on they were released.
I see. And to have one final question for you as well, Amnesty International is seen to be very effective at lobbying governments to do more to find these missing people. How would you evaluate Amnesty's work in Ukraine and the effect that it has in general?
Cooperating with the Ukrainian government is always challenging, but at some point it can be effective. For instance, we have quite effective cooperation with Ombudsman Office, and they do a lot of work to actually finding our people.
I've met some representatives from there actually, and they do amazing work, really.
They actually do a lot. So actually they are our entry point to government. So we can deliver our information for them, and then they kind of deal it on international, on governmental level. We also try to involve United Nations and some international mechanism, how to push Ukraine towards human rights-oriented politics.
Okay, that's very interesting. Well, I'm afraid we have to stop it there. Thank you very much for coming into our studio today, and it's been very interesting to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Maria Gurrieva, the Media and Communications Officer at Amnesty International Ukraine. You're watching UATV.